Hello, my name is Ronald Koorm and I'm an author of a book called Backing Bletchley, the Codebreaking Outstations from Eastcote to GCHQ. I'd like to give you a bit of a presentation on a subject which is the impact of codebreaking during the war and the build-up to D-Day, the influence that it had on D-Day itself. Many people don't realise how important the gathering of military intelligence was during World War II. We've all heard of Bletchley Park, of course. That was the headquarters of codebreaking using mathematicians and academics. Bletchley Park was a mix of civilians and military people, and it had various codebreaking machines over the years. Many people don't realise that there were two parallel systems operating in terms of gathering German military intelligence. One was the Enigma machine, which was the German principal encoding machine, and there were up to 100,000 of these built. Alan Turing had designed a machine, an electromechanical machine called the BOMB, B-O-M-B-E. There were over 200 of these made up in Hertfordshire. They were distributed amongst Bletchley Park and the Codebreaking Outstations. So that was one system. But what happened was at Denmark Hill, a police station in South London, one day, when they were listening in to the Morse code messages, someone heard something rather strange. It was very, very fast, didn't sound like Morse code at all, and they aroused the suspicions of Bletchley Park and said, we've got something different here. So Bletchley Park listened in and they said, this is not Morse, this is something rather different, created perhaps by some other machine. So this worried Bletchley Park and the Allies considerably. It was difficult enough dealing with the Enigma machine, all the variations and changes and the modifications to Alan Turing's bombs, but now there could be another machine or series of machines which looked perhaps even more advanced than Enigma. We had that problem. We had to work out what was actually generating this non-Morse message, and we then had to find a solution to it. It turned out that Alan Turing's machines would not be compatible in any way, shape or form with the new incoming non-Morse messages. Those non-Morse messages were created on a teleprinter attachment which the Germans had devised. There was a typewriter type machine and a single operator, so you didn't need 2 or 3 people like you did in Enigma to encode messages. The Lorenz machine was an advanced German machine intended for the German High Command. Adolf Hitler was very pleased with the Enigma machine, but wanted something even more secure for communication with his generals, field marshals. So there were not many Lorenz machines built, but they didn't need to be. They were for his higher echelon of military officers. They would incorporate information with strategic decisions, whereas Enigma was mainly for tactical decisions. Now this gave the Allies a problem, because they needed to gather more information from Lorenz, whereas they had a replica, at least, of Enigma, so they knew what it looked like and how it was comprised. Eventually there was a young mathematician at Bletchley Park called Bill Tutt, and he worked on the problem of trying to decipher what was the construction of this machine, how many wheels or rotors it had, how it was wired, etc. And he did this in a number of different ways, using squared paper, using mathematics, patterns, algorithms, all sorts of methods. Eventually he was able, with a bit of help from others, but principally it was him who reverse engineered the Lorenz machine. He found out how many wheels it had, which were generally 12. He found out the pattern of the wiring, etc. This was a great advance for the Allies. So Bill Tutt, the young mathematician at Bletchley Park, had done the Allies a great service in reverse engineering the structure of the German Nazi Lorenz teleprinter attachment encoding machine, and even though he'd never seen it, he had worked out how many wheels it had, how it was cabled and structured. And this was a first stage into cracking the Lorenz codes. But we had a long way to go. We needed collection of more Lorenz non-Morse intelligence, and we set up a special place called Knockholt, which was at Ivy Farm in Kent. This was going to be a specialist listening station for the Allies to collect Lorenz advanced Nazi intelligence. There would be other voice stations such as Sandridge near St Albans, and these would specialise in non-Morse messages. But it's one thing collecting the messages, it's another thing to decode them. So what was really required was some fast means of decoding them. You could do it manually, and that's what they had to do initially, but it would take a long time because of the complexity and the number of permutations on a 12-wheel Lorenz machine. Later on there would be even more advanced German encoding machines, much more advanced than even Lorenz and difficult to crack. But Lorenz was used quite extensively for the German High Command. Now, if we found out what the German High Command was thinking, or had planning for their strategic actions, the order of battle in France and elsewhere, then this was going to be a major coup for the Allies. Initially, we found out that Alan Turing's bomb machines, which were used to tackle the Enigma, unfortunately were not compatible with the Lorenz data. So we had to design a new system, and on 3 bases, including the Post Office Research Establishment at Dollis Hill in North London, a machine called the Robinson, or Heath Robinson as he was nicknamed, was built. This incorporated a few valves, but it was essentially quite a large structure, and it used large spools of punch tape which had to be synchronised by the Women's Royal Naval Service, or the Wrens, to make the thing work. So Robinson did work, but unfortunately it wasn't that reliable, and the tape kept on breaking. It was very, very difficult to synchronise these 2 tapes. So we needed an even better solution. Bletchley Park, there was a senior mathematician, Max Newman. He was introduced by Alan Turing to a GPO engineer who was based at Dollis Hill in North London, and that was Tommy Flowers. Tommy Flowers was approached by Max Newman, said, look, we know roughly how this machine works. We've never seen it before, but we need something much more effective than this Robinson, which is a nightmare to operate. We need to simplify it, but we need to make sure it's robust and it works. Tommy Flowers said, okay, let's work together. I've got an idea, but we need to use a lot of valves. How many valves? Well, 1,500 per machine. Tommy Flowers was heavily criticised by Bletchley Park for potentially thinking about wasting resources. Valves were expensive, they're difficult to make, it was wartime. We needed to find a better source. But Tommy Flowers knew that if you used the valves as digital switches and not just amplifiers, that could speed up the processing of the information to decode the message and the settings. So Tommy Flowers worked very closely with Max Newman, and it was Max Newman who decided that the machine that they would devise would not tackle the entire rotors or all the wheels of the machine. It would only tackle part of it. So Tommy Flowers went away, and over several months, many months, he and his team of GPO engineers built the world's first semi-programmable computer called Colossus. It had 1,500 valves. He avoided the valves failing by keeping them switched on permanently. If you didn't switch off the power to them and restart them, basically they would last a lot longer. This was the background to the Colossus machine, the world's first semi-programmable computer. When it was set up at Bletchley Park by Tommy Flowers and his team, they tested it, it worked. Set it up again, it worked. He wrote in his diary, Colossus worked at Bletchley Park after being set up. Car broke down on the way home. Tommy Flowers' car was not as reliable as Colossus machine. We had double agents over in this country, and one of the key double agents was a guy called Puyol, who was a Spaniard who had fought in the Civil War, and he was a bit of an eccentric. He nearly got shot by firing squad when he was in the Spanish Civil War, but he managed to escape, and he offered his services to the British, to the Allies, to say, look, I hate the Nazis, take me on board and I'll be an agent, I'll make contact. We didn't take him seriously, but eventually he did make contact with the Nazis, and we took him on board, trained him up as a double agent. He was to prove very, very useful. One of the things he did, he convinced the Germans, his contacts, that he had a whole network of agents working for him across the country, even as far as Glasgow in Scotland, where he made an error by saying the Glaswegians will do anything for a litre of wine. Well, one thing they probably didn't drink a lot of in Glasgow was wine, and they certainly wouldn't buy it in litres. But he wasn't found out about this. But he had built up this enormous network of people. The Germans were convinced that these people were there supporting him. In fact, virtually every one of those agents was fictitious, didn't exist, only existed on paper. Agent Garbo fought in the Spanish Civil War for both sides without firing off a single bullet. He was very fortunate not to have been shot by firing squad. In 1941, he tried to make contact with the British in Madrid and Lisbon on 3 occasions. He eventually persuaded the Germans he could be a spy for the Nazis in England. Pujol, or Garbo, moved to Lisbon initially and pretended to be in England. He wrote reports for the Germans based on English magazines and books which he bought. In April 1942, Pujol, he was brought to London. He was managed by the Secret Service, and it was he who invented 27 sub-agents across the country and convinced the Nazis that they were real people. He had contact with Madrid using handwritten letters, and they contained secret writing, and they were addressed to a postbox in Lisbon, given to him by the Germans. Pujol and his controller, Harris, of the Secret Service, wrote 315 letters, averaging 2,000 words each. He was able to extract lots of money from the Germans, hundreds of thousands of pounds, to support his imaginary network. The only reason we did this was to feed selective bits of information across to the Nazis and to convince them that there was a build-up to what was going to be an enormous assault on France, and to keep them guessing as to where this was going to be. There were a number of ideas that we had to confuse the Nazi war machine. The Allies had 2 sections of an operation under Operation Fortitude. Fortitude North was about keeping the Nazis in Norway occupied so that they wouldn't be sent down to France. Operation Fortitude South was the operation which was relevant to D-Day and the assault at Normandy, and relied upon convincing and misleading the Germans that a great force in Kent and southern England would come over on the Pas de Calais and not Normandy. One of the systems that we had was to devise an imaginary army group called FUSAG, First US Army Group. This would be managed, commanded by General Patton. The Germans had great respect for General Patton. It would be based in southeast England, principally around Kent and surroundings, and it would have radio traffic between Americans as you would have in any army group divisions communicating with one another, so that it would be possible for the Germans to listen in. It would also have landing craft, tanks, etc., but the majority of those were going to be rubber inflatable tanks. This was so that if there were any overflying aircraft, spotter planes from the Germans, they would see a whole load more tanks and landing craft near the coast, which was ready to come over across the Pas de Calais. So this was fake news in an early stage. Although the First US Army Group, or FUSAG, was a fictitious unit invented by the British to confuse the enemy, there were a handful of personnel, military personnel, taken from other units, and they would wear uniforms and have shoulder insignia patches to impersonate different divisions. There would even be fake wedding announcements of some of the soldiers getting married. This was all adding to the big con trick to confuse and alarm the enemy that this was a real army group waiting to attack over the channel. So how did the double agent Garbo, who was now working for the British and deceiving and misleading the Germans, how did he influence D-Day? Well, of course, the intelligence coming in was coming into Knockholt and other specialist bases and then being processed by the Robinson and Colossus machines up at Bletchley Park. Those machines would not be decoding all the settings of all the wheels on the Lorenz machine. There were 12 wheels of them. That would only be for part of the system. So it was a 2-stage process. The first stage was to put the tape through one of the machines and then to analyse it and come up with some settings. You would then pass it over to a completely different section at Bletchley Park called the testery. The testery had cryptographers there who would manually decode the message which had come in. And then finally it would have to be tested on one of these tunny machines which had been built for Bletchley Park and was the equivalent of a Lorenz advanced teleprinter attachment. And then all you had to do was to get a translator to translate it from German into English, and then you could read the message. And these would be strategic messages, in other words, strategic information from the German High Command. Some would actually be produced by Adolf Hitler, the Führer himself. So they were really important messages. So one of the aspects of having double agents feeding restricted information to Germans was that as we approached D-Day, we found that we needed to convince them even more that this first US Army group was going to come over at Pas de Calais. Even if there were other landings elsewhere in France, they were really a diversionary tactic and no more. So, if we came over, say, in Normandy, that was just a smaller force just to divert and confuse the enemy and to take away their resources. Agent Garbo was given a message to transmit literally just before D-Day, and it was a very important message. It was vetted by the Allies, by his controller, and it was timed to reach them such that it wasn't too early, but it wasn't too late. General von Rundstedt, later become Field Marshal von Rundstedt in France, was the Commander-in-Chief West, OB West. He had two army groups under his command, Army Group B, Northern France and in the Netherlands, and Army Group G in the south of France. We were very interested to intercept any intelligence which was coming through on the jellyfish coded link, the communication link between Paris and Berlin, between Adolf Hitler and General von Rundstedt. It would be von Rundstedt who would be feeding back information to headquarters as to the position of his troops and his strategic planning. He would be receiving instructions, of course, from Adolf Hitler and senior officers. So what we had to do was to listen in to that communication link, decode it quickly, and then keep our own commanders informed. Double Agent Garber, who was working for us, he had his own role to play. He had to send this very carefully presented message, I think late at night, just before D-Day, to indicate that basically D-Day was happening. It was timed so that by the time they received this information in Berlin and decoded it, essentially D-Day would already be on the beaches. It would be too late to be of any great use. When Agent Garber sent the message, he didn't get a response. It was, I think, in the middle of the night, and the person at the other end wasn't at his station or wasn't listening in. Garbo got very upset about this. He then complained, made a formal complaint over the radio to say, look, I'm risking my life here. I'm giving you crucial information to save the fatherland, and you have just ignored me. I don't know why I bother. Basically, he quickly got an apology saying, I'm sorry that this shouldn't have happened. We've let you down and you're doing a wonderful job, and you'll be recognised for your services to the fatherland. So what the British really wanted was not just to intercept the message coming back to Agent Garbo, because that would not come via the High Command link. We wanted to see what was in the intelligence message coming from Berlin to Paris, the jellyfish link, which would come to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. And eventually that was intercepted at Knockholt in Kent, and it was sent up to Bletchley Park, quickly deciphered via Colossus. The Colossus machine which did this was the Mark II version, which worked much faster than the Mark I. And we had confirmation that the Germans had fallen for the trap that was still going to be coming over Pas de Calais as the main force, and that any other force that comes on the beaches of France would be a much smaller diversionary force. Once D-Day happened and we were on the beaches, what we'd thought would happen was the Germans would realise that this was such a large force coming over at Omaha, Gold and Sword Beach that it must be the main force. But they didn't. They fell for the trap. They were still waiting the first US Army group, the fictitious Army group, to come from Kent over the Pas de Calais, where all their panzer divisions were sort of grouped up. I think it was Rommel who wanted to release panzer divisions from Pas-de-Calais area to come down towards Normandy. And his instruction was overruled by Field Marshal von Rundstedt. He said, no, you'll take those back to Calais, because the 1st US Army Group is going to come over shortly, and you must be prepared for them. So this was disastrous for the Germans. The decision by Germans to keep their panzer divisions largely around Pas-de-Calais, whereas they could have been further south to repel the invasion at Gold, Sword and Omaha beaches in Normandy, that was a disaster for them. They had first-class crack troops, SS divisions, etc., which were doing nothing, just hanging around waiting for an invasion at Pas-de-Calais, which was not actually going to come. In July and August 1944, the Germans kept 2 Nazi armoured divisions and 19 infantry divisions in the Pas-de-Calais, awaiting the 1st US Army Group invasion across the Channel. And it was weeks, several weeks after we had landed on the beaches at Normandy, that Germans realised that perhaps this invasion across Pas-de-Calais wasn't going to come, at least no time soon, and they needed to reinforce their troops in von Rundstedt down near Normandy. By this time, of course, the Americans, Canadians, British and the Commonwealth countries, allies, were already in France, driving towards Berlin. Yes, it was difficult in some areas, the Bocage and around Cherbourg, but we were getting supplies in, we were refreshing our troops, reinforcing them, and basically Agent Garber had done his job. The Germans were still impressed with Agent Garber because he didn't know what they would think of him. He actually was given a medal, an Iron Cross, for his services to the Führer, because they still recognised that he was taking an enormous risk as an agent for the fatherland. So he received an Iron Cross from the Germans. Little did they know that his agent's network was totally fictitious, didn't exist. Little did they know that Garbo was actually a double agent acting for the Allies and wanted to ensure the destruction of the Nazi war machine. It's not every day that the welfare of a dog becomes important to military commanders and the Allies, but it was such a case with a dog which was nicknamed Babs. I think it was a terrier during World War II and was owned by a Franco-Russian lady who had the nickname of Agent Treasure. She was a double agent, basically working for the Allies in England, and her contact was in Portugal. She was devoted to her dog, but she was not able to bring it across to Britain when she came to work over here because of the quarantine laws and the rabies laws. So she didn't really understand that. She was getting homesick and she actually wanted to return home. Just before D-Day, she had been promised that we would try and find a way around the rabies laws and quarantine by getting perhaps an American plane or British plane to fly the dog via Gibraltar back to England to her. But that didn't happen, and she didn't know why. And she just hoped her dog was well looked after. Well, she went over to Portugal just before D-Day, and she discovered to her horror that her dog had died due to neglect. She was absolutely devastated. She didn't know what to do. She was so angry that she was determined that when she came back to England that she would send a coded message to the German contact, basically to say she'd been compromised, she'd been found out, discovered, and she would also decide to inform them that it was a great big deception to say that we were coming across the Pas-de-Calais, that this was not going to happen. And that could have really had a major effect on D-Day. Well, as it turns out, when she returned back to England without her dog, just before D-Day, she changed her mind. She changed her mind and she decided not to send the coded message, which would have been some sort of phrase or sentence with a word missing or something like that. But we, as the Allies, as her controllers, were not aware of exactly what that phrase was going to be. So we couldn't trust her anymore. We couldn't trust her. So she was taken off duties and not allowed to operate as a double agent since then. So it's quite alarming to think that something as small as a dog could have actually had an impact on the outcome of D-Day in World War II and could have affected the lives of many hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. Fortunately, that didn't happen in that way. And Agent Garbo, who was the double agent who had worked very closely with their allies, he, after the war, was giving, I think, an MBE, a medal, and he was the only person, I think, during World War II who was given medals by both sides. In other words, the Nazis, he got an Iron Cross and he got, I think, an MBE from the British public. And he was able to extract, I think, £350,000 from the Nazis during the war to support his network of fictitious double agents. This was quite a coup for Agent Garber. He apparently exiled to, I think it was Argentina or one of the South American countries after the war, because he felt he was still exposed and at risk if the Nazi sympathisers ever found out what he had been doing for the British. So he disappeared for a while. In conclusion, the British and the Allies together formed this confidence trick to provide fake news to the Nazi German war machine in a couple of ways. One was the creation of the first US Army group in southern England, and the other was the establishment of double agents, where the Germans thought they were working for them, but actually they were working for the British. The first US Army group was so convincing that after the war, some maps of Great Britain were acquired, which were prepared by the Germans during the war, and they showed quite clearly the positioning in southeast England of the first US Army group. So they thought they were real. The confidence trick had worked really well. We had a combination of radio traffic to help confuse the enemy, and we also had physical items such as rubber landing craft, rubber tanks, tents, etc., which would create an overall impression there were quite a lot of personnel, over 1 million personnel in southern England waiting to cross the Channel. So it does show that if you get it right, it can make an enormous difference to the outcome of the war, and it probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives. So I hope this has been of interest to you. It's a very complex subject. If you want to find more information, then look up Fortitude South, Operation Fortitude South on the internet, Agent Garbo or Pujol, Pujol. And if you want to learn out more about the lady with the dog, that was Agent Treasure with a dog who's called Babs. And you'll find, I think, a picture of Babs on the internet. Thank you. It's Ronald Koorm signing off. This podcast was produced specifically for Headstone Manor Museum in Harrow and is the copyright of Ronald Koorm, author of Backing Bletchley, the Codebreaking Stations from Eastcote to GCHQ. Copyright 2020.